Greetings once again to Theology 333, the African American Religious Experience. I'm Dr. Gregory Jones, and I'm bringing to you some lecture series regarding the African American Religious Experience. We have just talked about slave religion and survival theology, and we're going into a section this time dealing with the issue of slave insurrection and revolt, slave revolt, that we see beginning to happen in America. And the reason why I think we need to have this particular section is because, this lecture session is because I think that we see the African Americans now, or the Africans in America now, beginning to draw from the stories of resistance and the stories of struggle from the biblical text. And so I want to give you some examples. I want you to take a look at some of the examples of some of this resistance in the person of the resistors themselves, in the context of slavery evolving and developing in America. One of the first things I want to do in this lecture session is to touch base with our text. Black Religion, Black Radicalism by Wilmore is a text that we're using for some history, along with Canaan Land, which is done by, I believe, Albert Roboteau, and we're looking at Deotis Roberts' Afrocentric Christianity as possible texts that we use in this course. But I want you to, in particular, take a look at the overview of the readings in support of this lecture, the chapters dealing with not peace but the sword, which will talk about slave insurrections, and the religion of a slave, which we just had a lecture series on. I want you to keep pace in your readings with regards to the lecture series. And then we're going to later on look at three generals in specific in the Lord's army. We're going to look at three examples of the use of biblical texts in the spurring of slave resistance to this horrific kind of experience of slavery in America. Also, there are two pamphlets within the readings that I want you to pay close attention to. They're important to the resistance movement during this period and the development of the independent church. What we have to understand is that the African American community, or the Africans in America, are resisting from the time that they hit the shores until today. And we see this resistance being evolved in several ways. The first way we see resistance is the adaptation of the slave to American culture, American society. But we also see resistance in terms of writings beginning to come to pass. And this happens very quickly within the African and the African American community, the writings and pamphlets that begin to resist the issue of slavery. So what we're talking about is a tremendous surge in intellectual community to begin to develop the currency, not only to understand the context that you're in, but then to evolve that understanding into a document that is written to resist the kind of conditions that the Africans find themselves in this community. As we look at the generations that produced our community, we're looking at a generation of tremendous people who evolved in such a way to begin to very early raise significant issues about slavery and white racism and institutional racism and white supremacy in America. The two pamphlets that I want you to pay attention to is Young's Ethiopian Manifesto, in defense of the black man's rights in the universe. In 1829, February, written by Robert Alexander Young. This young man puts together a document that challenges in some prophetic and mystical ways this notion of Africans being bred for this type of enslavement. He also challenges the notion of the biblical interpretation of the right to enslave Africans in this document. So we want to pay attention to that. Another young man that we want to pay attention to in terms of a pamphlet or a writing was the appeal to the colored citizens of the world, written by David Walker in 3 editions in September of 1829. And so this is some early writings that we see. There are earlier writings, but these are pamphlets that gain notoriety not only within their circle and their location, but they begin to spread out, and other people in other communities, other cultures began to understand that this notion of slavery in America is not something that is just abided by or taken passively by Africans in America. So those 2 documents are 2 documents that you need to pay special attention to in your readings, as well as you need to be reading Slave Religion. You need to be reading Not Peace But a Sword. You need to be reading The 3 Generals in the Lord's Army. You need to be moving through that Wilmore text pretty rapidly, and I'll be asking test questions in relationship to that, as well as discussion questions. Now today, what we're going to look at is slave revolt and resistance, and religious radicalism, and the origins of plantation life, and how we see plantation life begin to parallel this radical religious position that slaves are starting to take. So we see, on one hand, we see slave resistance. On the other hand, we see an evolution of plantation life that kind of feeds the resistance, feeds the oppression, if you will, of Africans in America in such a way that resistance becomes more vocal, it becomes more actual in terms of how people deal with the situation that they find themselves in. Early in the history of this country, there was resistance to slavery as indentured servitude became permanent for Africans in America. And we need to read a book called Begrimed in Black by Hood. Hood writes a work about color consciousness, and he suggests that when we look at indentured servitude, which is for about 7 years for everyone who came to the country that was under prosecution for owing money or things of that nature, we see a transition that takes place as the advent of the slave trade becomes more and more prolific. We see indentured servitude for whites maintaining itself, but as we see blacks being moved into indentured servitude, we see something that happens in terms of permanent indentureship. Permanent indentureship, that is to say, from color consciousness, in other words, targeted toward Africans and people of color, is this notion that you need to be kept in terms of permanently indentured. And we see that happening in America early on because of the displacement and the disconnect that Africans have in America. There's such a long way from our homeland till they cannot make a connection, and it's very easy for Europeans to take advantage of Africans in that light. And so we see a permanent indentureship being advocated and finally legislated for Africans in America. In 1732, for example, Governor Drysdale sent a message to the colony in regards to keeping people in permanent indentureship. And one of the things that he's dealing with there's a slave revolt that takes place in 1732. And so as a response to the permanent indentureship, what we also see is slaves saying, no, we're not having this. And people taking up arms, or people trying to resist as best they can. We see that taking place early on in the development of this country. Well before we become a nation, we see struggles taking place with colonies in relationship to slaves, and slaves resisting permanent indentureship. An insurrection occurred in the northern neck region of Virginia, and even as early as 1687. And again in 1722, which is earlier. We see indentured servants, we see slaves coming together and resisting this whole notion of slavery in America. In 1712, we see a famous insurrection that broke out and killed a number of people in New York City. Fires would set slaves, indentured servants, slaves, permanent indentureship, individuals set fires in New York City and resisted this whole notion of slavery in America. Related to a school of blacks, that particular insurrection was dealing with a school of blacks started by Elias Newell. and the Kamanti and Papa tribes from West Africa. These tribes came together, were brought together in slavery and were being used in New York. And this young man was trying to educate them, and somehow resistance had came to flower because of how the horrific treatment of blacks in New York City, a northern colony, if you will. During 1739 and 1740, 3 insurrections in South Carolina were led by Catholic priests. And this was a very powerful kind of statement between Protestant and Catholic struggles that had taken place. Catholic priests and Quakers in particular were noted for their willingness to fight and resist the expansion of slavery in the South in particular. In 1741 in Charlestown, fires were set. These were all pre-Civil War kinds of insurrections spurred by the suggestions and recommendation of the African religious leadership in America. And let me say a little about that. The preacher or the preachers or the people who were doing spiritual leadership during that time would either in inference or through biblical imagery or through actual just fire and brimstone kinds of delivery would suggest that ultimately what the goal is for Africans is freedom, and even if heaven need to be our home, you know, we would sing a song, Lord God, you know, I long to be with you. If heaven is not my home, Lord, what would I do? I don't feel at home anymore. These kinds of spirituals, these kind of songs all indicated this encouragement for Africans in America to take seriously the notion of freedom, to take seriously the notion of resistance, the notion of liberation, and the notion of survival in the context of slavery and racism in America. This discontentment with white racism and the institution of slavery. An example of that, great example, is the history of Haiti. Is an entire history of slaves in the Caribbean or the West Indies, if you will, being a part of a resistance community that eventually finds their independence. And Haiti is a very interesting subject, and we will take a look at it in greater detail later. What we see in Haiti is we see African slaves essentially leading a revolution against the French and against the Spanish and against France and Spain, starting in 1789 with Raymond and Augré's Revolt, and ending with the famous leadership of Toussaint L'Ouverture. We thank God for the opportunity to be able to look at such an excellent example of slavery being resisted, and Haiti never has recovered from the treatment for being a slave resistant nation that has come to independence in the Western Hemisphere. It appears, if we look at history, we see that Haiti has always been treated as a pariah, if you will, to the development of the Western Hemisphere and in the Caribbean. It's always been kept poor because of this history of resistance. Check it out now. I know you're probably saying, "Oh, well, can you prove that? Can we find that academically?" And I'm saying, yes, we can find that academically. And if you look at what has happened of late in Haiti, even with the earthquake and the kinds of responses that we've had to it, there have been great responses to it, but Haiti has been kept under the thumb of the Western industrialized community for a very long time. And it has a lot to do with its history in terms of resistance. And so we will look at that in more detail later. Remember that resistance is kind of parallel to the time that we're looking at. 1789 to 1793, and then we see going on, and we see the development of the country, but we see changes, dramatic changes taking place, even as this great leader, Toussaint Louverture, is the first president and struggling, trying to keep Haiti on top of things in terms of its people. We see a vast resistance to his leadership within the Western community. Now, let's shift a bit and talk about some aspects of plantation life, because I think plantation life affects the whole atmosphere of resistance and the atmosphere of revolt that we see happening with Africans in America. Let's first of all kind of get the designations right. You know, Malcolm talks about field Negroes and house Negroes, and we'll talk about Malcolm X a little later and how he defines his designations. But field slaves were slaves that worked hard labor from 15 to 18 hours in the field. I have personally cut sugar cane in Louisiana, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It is not an easy job. And if you do it for an hour, you'll get tired. Imagine having to do it for 18 hours a day and cutting it from day to night. So if we look at the development of the labor pools dealing with tobacco, cotton, rice, tea, rum, sugarcane, these are labor-intensive kinds of products that are being brought up from the South. The house slaves, on the other hand, are indentured or kept into the house or around the house, and their labor, even though it wasn't as intensive, it was perpetual in terms of the development of the community. And so they did everything: washed the clothes, cooked, cleaned, ironed, kept the house clean, kept the grounds clean. They were in perpetual motion. They could be called upon at any time. Plus, the value added of they were systematically raped. They were systematically kept in bondage. The division was instituted by masters in color consciousness with the Willie Lynch theories, the dark and light, the young and old kinds of divisions. We see the mistreatment among populations. We see this coming out of Sparta. If we look at the history of Sparta and its intelligence community, which was an ancient Greek military state, we see the Spartan military intelligence using the same kind of Willie Lynch-like kinds of notion. And Willie Lynch is looked at as being maybe a myth or urban myth, but we do see psychological divisions being employed by slave masters in the plantation community. Let's talk about diet very quickly. They were fed animal scraps and leftovers from slaughter of domestic cattle. They had to supplement their diet to sustain energy for 18-hour labor day. What is called now soul food is the efforts of Africans in America to survive a lack of basic sustenance and protein-based kinds of diets. Field hands operated every mechanical device to sustain plantation. House slaves managed and ran households for massa. They joined forces to provide resources to slaves who decided to run or resist slavery, and maps, food, houses, clothes, guns, what was needed was taken from these sources. Slaves were not allowed to worship, but found ways to gather and share basic plans to address the deep discontent of the slave life on plantations. Some plantations operated as expanded slave factories, breeding centers to populate the ever-growing need for slave labor capitalism. This is why, and I'm going to end with this is why slave insurrection became more frequent and why slavery became more brutal and violent. In order to maintain control, slave owners had to increasingly dehumanize the product. The slave owner had to find a way to justify slavery, and we see the rise of biblical and human science interpretations to justify the treatment of Africans in America. We'll say more about this next time. I'll see you in session 9.